The cable installer grabbed my arm. Every house on this block has hidden cameras that aren't on your security system. We were all being watched without knowing it. Garrett from Tech Connect Cable was supposed to be doing a routine installation in our new house. We'd moved to Oakwood Heights 3 months ago because it seemed like the perfect suburban neighborhood. Great schools, low crime, friendly neighbors who brought casseroles when you moved in. The American dream, basically. But when Garrett climbed down from our attic, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. Instead of asking me to sign the work order, he grabbed my arm with an intensity that made my stomach drop. "Ma'am, we need to talk privately, right now." His voice was barely above a whisper, and he kept glancing toward the windows like someone might be watching us. "Is everything okay with the installation?" I asked, confused by his strange behavior. Garrett had been friendly and professional for the past 2 hours, joking about our moving boxes and complimenting our choice of neighborhood. This sudden shift felt completely wrong. "The installation is fine, but there's something else up there you need to know about." Garrett pulled out his phone and showed me photos he'd taken in our attic. "These cameras aren't part of any security system you installed, are they?" The images showed small, professional-grade surveillance equipment mounted in corners I'd never even seen. Tiny lenses pointed down through what looked like pinhole openings in our ceiling. My mouth went dry. We'd never installed any security cameras anywhere in the house. "Are you sure those aren't just old equipment from the previous owners?" I asked, though even as I said it, the cameras looked way too modern and well-maintained to be forgotten remnants. Garrett shook his head grimly. "That's what I thought at first. But look at this." He swiped to another photo showing thick cables running from the cameras through the walls. "These are connected to a main hub that's hardwired into the house's electrical system. Professional installation, probably cost thousands of dollars, and the cables run outside to a junction box that connects to the street." I felt dizzy looking at the photos. Someone had been watching everything we did in our own home for 3 months. Our breakfast conversations, our arguments about money, our private moments when we thought we were alone. Who would do this? And why? "That's not even the worst part," Garrett continued, his voice getting even quieter. "I've done 12 installations on this block in the past year. Every single house has the same setup. Every house on this block has hidden cameras that aren't on your security system. We were all being watched without knowing it. The room felt like it was spinning. Our entire street was under surveillance? That's impossible. Someone would have noticed during home inspections or renovations. But even as I protested, I remembered how our realtor had rushed us through the final walkthrough and how the home inspector had seemed to skip the attic entirely. Garrett pulled up more photos on his phone. "Here's the thing that really freaked me out. I recognize this equipment. It's the same surveillance gear that government contractors use, military-grade stuff, way beyond what any private security company would install." He showed me close-up shots of serial numbers and manufacturer labels. "This isn't some perverted neighbor with hidden cameras. This is professional intelligence-gathering equipment." I had to sit down. The implications were overwhelming. "How long do you think these have been here?" My voice came out as barely a whisper because I was starting to realize that everything we'd done since moving in had potentially been recorded. Based on the installation quality and the dust patterns, I'd guess these were installed when the house was built, maybe even before the previous owners moved in. Garrett glanced around our living room like he was seeing it differently now. "Which means whoever set this up has been planning this for years." That's when I remembered something that had seemed odd at the time, but I'd dismissed. When we were house hunting, our realtor had been unusually pushy about this specific neighborhood. She'd shown us houses in other areas, but kept steering us back to Oakwood Heights, saying it was perfect for our profile, and that we'd fit right in with the community demographic. "Garrett, I need to ask you something important. Did the cable company send you specifically to this neighborhood, or was it random?" I was starting to connect dots that painted a terrifying picture. His expression darkened. "That's actually what made me suspicious enough to take photos. My dispatcher told me to prioritize all calls from Oakwood Heights and to be extra thorough with attic inspections. He said the company had a special contract for this area. When I asked what that meant, he told me not to worry about it and just do the work. The special contract detail made everything worse. It suggested the surveillance wasn't random but part of some organized operation. "Do you think your company knows about the cameras?" Garrett was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of what he'd discovered. "I don't know, but I'm starting to think some people at Tech Connect might be involved. The work orders for this neighborhood always come with weird instructions about documenting existing wiring and taking photos of anything unusual we find in attics or basements." My phone started buzzing with a text from my husband David, who was at work. "Installation going okay? Everything looking normal?" The message that would have seemed perfectly innocent this morning now felt ominous. How did he know to ask if things looked normal? I showed Garrett the text, and his face went even paler. "Ma'am, I think you need to be very careful about who you trust with this information. If your whole neighborhood is under surveillance, there's probably a reason. And if someone went to this much trouble to watch you, they're not going to be happy when they find out you know. What should I do?" I felt completely out of my depth. This wasn't something they teach you how to handle in normal life. "Do you call the police? The FBI? What if some of them are involved too?" Garrett looked around the room one more time, then made a decision. "I'm going to give you my personal cell phone number. If anything weird happens, if people start asking questions about the cable work, if your neighbors start acting strange, if you notice cars parked outside that shouldn't be there, Call me immediately. He wrote his number on the back of a Tech Connect business card. I'm also going to pretend this installation took longer than normal and that I need to come back tomorrow to finish some work. That gives you 24 hours to figure out your next move without anyone getting suspicious about why I was here so long today. After Garrett left, I sat in my living room staring at the ceiling, knowing there were cameras up there recording my every move. The house that had felt like our sanctuary now felt like a fishbowl. Every conversation, every private moment, every argument or intimate interaction had potentially been watched and recorded by unknown people for unknown purposes. I started thinking about our neighbors differently too. The friendly couple next door, who always seemed to know when packages arrived at our house. The elderly man across the street who was always outside gardening, but seemed to pay close attention to everyone's comings and goings. The woman 2 houses down who had welcomed us with homemade cookies and asked a lot of detailed questions about our jobs and daily routines. Were they part of this surveillance operation, or were they victims like us? How could you tell the difference between genuine neighborly interest and intelligence gathering? That evening, I couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time David asked about my day or mentioned something he'd observed about our neighbors, I wondered if he was somehow involved. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our move to this neighborhood hadn't been as random as I'd believed. I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. How our internet had been set up unusually quickly when we moved in, with the technician saying the house was already configured for premium service. How our utility bills seemed lower than expected, as if someone else was subsidizing our costs. How we'd received immediate approval for our mortgage despite having just average credit scores. But that wasn't even the worst part. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. Before Garrett returned, I was going to test something. I sat in different rooms of the house and had loud, fake phone conversations about fabricated plans. Yes, I'll be at the dentist from 2 to 4 p.m. today. We're thinking about taking a vacation to Colorado next month. I'm meeting my sister for lunch at that new restaurant downtown. Then I waited to see if anyone would react to the false information. If neighbors suddenly appeared when I was supposedly leaving for fake appointments, or if David mentioned Colorado vacation ideas out of nowhere, I'd know the surveillance was active and someone was acting on the information. By noon, 3 different neighbors had found excuses to talk to me, and 2 of them mentioned dental work and vacation planning in ways that felt too coincidental. Mrs. Patterson from next door came over to borrow sugar and casually mentioned that Colorado was beautiful this time of year. Mr. Fisher from across the street was suddenly working in his front yard when I left the house and asked if I was heading to an appointment. When Garrett returned that afternoon, I told him about my test and the results. His expression was grim. "Ma'am, you've just confirmed that not only are you being watched, but the information is being shared with people in your immediate vicinity. This is way bigger than just surveillance cameras." Garrett had done some research overnight and discovered something that made the situation even more serious. I looked up the property records for every house on this block. They were all purchased within a 2-year period, and every buyer got financing through the same mortgage company, a company that doesn't seem to exist anywhere else in the state. The pattern suggested our entire neighborhood had been artificially created, with residents selected and placed according to some criteria we didn't understand. Garrett, do you think we're in some kind of social experiment? Or worse? I think you're part of something that requires serious government resources to maintain. The equipment, the coordination, the financing. This is an amateur hour. Someone with significant power and funding wanted to monitor this specific group of people. Garrett handed me a folder of documents he'd printed. I also found something interesting about your realtor. The documents showed that Stephanie Crow, who had sold us our house, had only been licensed as a realtor for 6 months before we met her. Her previous employment history was classified with government agencies. She wasn't just a realtor who happened to specialize in our neighborhood. She was a government employee whose job was placing people like us in monitored housing. Garrett, I think we need to involve law enforcement. This is way beyond what we can handle ourselves. But even as I said it, I wondered how we could know which authorities to trust if this operation had government connections. Garrett agreed, but suggested we be strategic about it. We need to document everything first. If we go to the wrong people initially, they might shut down the whole operation and destroy evidence before we understand what's really happening. That night, Garrett returned with a friend named Vincent, who worked in private security and had experience with counter-surveillance. Together, they spent 3 hours documenting every camera, every cable, and every piece of monitoring equipment they could find in our house. Vincent also brought equipment to detect any audio recording devices we might have missed. What they found was even more extensive than we'd realized. In addition to the cameras, there were audio pickups in every room, including the bathrooms. Our phone lines were tapped, our internet activity was being monitored, and there were even sensors that could detect when we were home or away based on body heat and movement patterns. This is the most comprehensive domestic surveillance setup I've ever seen outside of a federal witness protection program, Vincent told me. But witness protection is designed to keep people safe. This feels more like a research facility where you're the test subjects. Vincent had brought specialized equipment that detected electromagnetic frequencies used by surveillance devices. The readings in our house were off the charts. Whatever they're doing here, they're gathering massive amounts of data. Voice patterns, movement tracking, biometric monitoring. This goes way beyond just watching what you do. 3 days later, Garrett called me with information that changed everything. I've been asking around very carefully. and I found out something important. Tech Connect Cable has been bought out by a subsidiary of a company that does government contractor work. Specifically, they specialize in behavioral research and social control experiments. The pieces were falling into place in a way that made me feel sick. Our neighborhood wasn't just under surveillance, it was a testing ground for studying how people behave when they think they're living normal lives, but are actually being monitored and manipulated. Vincent and I think you have two choices, Garrett continued. You can try to leave quietly and hope they don't follow you, or you can help us gather enough evidence to expose the whole operation. But if you choose to fight this, you need to understand that these people have significant resources and won't give up easily. I thought about David, who still didn't know what I'd discovered. I thought about our neighbors, who might be victims or might be complicit. I thought about the life we'd built in this house that had never really been private or secure. But before I could decide anything, the situation escalated in a way that made the choice for me. That same afternoon, I received a phone call from someone who claimed to be from the Homeowners Association. Mrs. Sullivan, we've had reports of unauthorized cable work being done at your address. We need to schedule an immediate inspection to ensure all installations meet neighborhood standards. I'd never heard of any Homeowners Association rules about cable installations, and we'd never received any documentation about such requirements when we moved in. When I asked for specifics about what reports they'd received and who had made them, the caller became evasive and hung up abruptly. Within an hour, a van marked HOA Compliance Services parked across from our house. Two men in official-looking uniforms got out and started taking photos of our property from multiple angles. When I went outside to ask what they were doing, they claimed they were documenting violations, but couldn't specify what violations they meant. I called Garrett immediately, and he arrived within 20 minutes with Vincent and a third person I hadn't met before, a woman named Rachel, who introduced herself as an investigative journalist specializing in government surveillance programs. Garrett filled me in on what you've discovered, she said. This is exactly the kind of story I've been investigating for 3 years. Rachel had been tracking similar operations in 12 different cities across the country. They always follow the same pattern: create artificial neighborhoods, place selected residents through compromised real estate agents, monitor everything under the guise of security research, then use the data to develop more effective population control methods. The HOA compliance van was still parked outside, and the men were now walking around our property with what looked like signal detection equipment. They know you know, Rachel said grimly. The fake HOA inspection is their way of figuring out how much you've discovered and what evidence you might have gathered. Vincent had brought more sophisticated counter-surveillance equipment this time, and what he found made everyone in the room go quiet. They've upgraded the monitoring since yesterday. New audio pickups, additional cameras, and something I've never seen before. Devices that can monitor your biometric data from a distance. Heart rate, blood pressure, stress levels. They're not just watching what you do anymore. They're monitoring your physical responses to everything. The escalation meant we were running out of time. Either we gathered enough evidence to expose the operation immediately, or we disappeared before they decided we knew too much. Rachel had contacts at the Washington Post and the Associated Press who specialized in government accountability stories, but she needed documentation that would hold up under legal scrutiny. I want to fight, I told them, but I need to know my family will be protected, and I need to understand exactly what we're fighting against. Over the next 6 hours, working through the night while the HOA compliance van maintained its vigil outside, we documented everything. Garrett and Vincent mapped every surveillance device in the house. Rachel interviewed me about every detail of our move to the neighborhood, our interactions with neighbors, and any unusual incidents we'd experienced. The breakthrough came when Vincent managed to trace the surveillance equipment's data transmission signals. Instead of going to a local monitoring station, all the information was being uploaded to servers at a facility 200 miles away, a location that Rachel recognized from her previous investigations. That's the Meridian Research Institute, she said, her voice tight with excitement. They're a private contractor that works exclusively with the Department of Homeland Security on domestic surveillance projects. If we can prove they're conducting unauthorized human research experiments on American citizens, this becomes a federal civil rights violation. But just as we thought we were making progress, everything went wrong. At 3 a.m., David came home from what he'd told me was a business trip. When he walked into our living room and saw Garrett, Vincent, and Rachel with all their equipment spread across our coffee table, his reaction wasn't surprise or confusion. It was resignation. I was hoping you wouldn't figure it out this quickly, he said quietly, sitting down in his usual chair like this was a normal conversation. They told me you probably wouldn't notice anything for at least 6 months, maybe longer. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My husband, the man I'd trusted with everything, the man I'd built this life with, had been part of the surveillance operation from the beginning. How long, was all I could manage to say. Since before we met, David answered, not looking at me. My job was to establish a relationship with someone who fit the research profile they were testing. Educated, middle class, socially conscious, likely to trust authority figures. You were selected from a database of potential subjects before I ever approached you at that coffee shop. The coffee shop where we'd met, where he'd seemed so perfectly charming and interested in all the same things I was interested in. Our entire relationship had been a lie designed to get me into this monitored neighborhood where I could be studied like a lab rat. Rachel was recording everything on her phone, and Vincent was documenting David's confession with professional audio equipment, but I felt like I was drowning in the implications of what I was learning. What exactly were they studying? Garrett asked, his voice hard with anger. David finally looked up, and I could see something that might have been genuine regret in his eyes. How to use personal relationships and social connections to control people's behavior without them realizing it. How to make surveillance feel normal and acceptable. How to identify and neutralize people who might resist or expose government monitoring programs. The scope of the experiment was staggering. They weren't just watching us. They were studying the most effective methods for watching everyone, using our neighborhood as a testing ground for surveillance techniques they planned to implement on a national scale. The neighbors who seemed so interested in our business, I said, pieces falling into place. They were testing different approaches to information gathering. David nodded. Mrs. Patterson was assigned to use friendly social interaction to gather intelligence. Mr. Fisher was testing whether obvious surveillance would be noticed or normalized over time. The couple next door was experimenting with creating artificial emergencies to test how residents would respond to crisis situations. Every interaction I'd had in this neighborhood had been scripted, designed to test my reactions and measure my responses to different types of social manipulation. Even the casseroles and welcome gifts had been part of the experiment, testing whether acts of kindness would make me more trusting and less suspicious of unusual behavior. Vincent had been documenting everything, but now he interrupted with urgent news. We have a problem. I'm detecting multiple vehicles surrounding the house, and they're using signal jamming equipment. Our communications are about to be cut off. Through the front window, we could see at least 6 unmarked vehicles had quietly positioned themselves around our block. The HOA compliance van was still there, but now it was joined by what looked like a full tactical response team. Rachel was frantically uploading files to secure servers, trying to get our documentation to her contacts before we lost internet access. If they detain us, this story dies. We need to get this information out right now. But as she worked, David stood up with an expression I'd never seen before. You can't publish this. The research is too important. The techniques they're developing could prevent terrorist attacks, identify domestic threats, keep people safe from dangers they don't even know exist. By lying to them and violating their basic human rights, Garrett shot back. By turning their own families into surveillance assets. David's response revealed the depth of his indoctrination into the program. Sometimes people have to sacrifice individual privacy for collective security. You've been living in one of the safest neighborhoods in America because every potential threat is identified and neutralized before it can become dangerous. The sound of vehicles surrounding our house was getting closer. Vincent's equipment showed that all cell phone signals in the area were being jammed and our internet connection had been severed. Whatever was about to happen, we were cut off from the outside world. Rachel made a decision that probably saved all our lives. Instead of trying to fight or hide, she opened the front door and walked outside with her hands visible, announcing loudly that she was a credentialed journalist and that multiple news organizations knew her location and expected regular check-ins. The tactical team that had surrounded our house immediately stopped their advance. Whatever their orders were, detaining a journalist who had followed proper notification procedures wasn't part of the plan. Over the next 12 hours, everything unraveled quickly. Rachel's contacts at major news organizations had indeed been expecting her regular check-ins, and when those stopped coming, they initiated emergency protocols for protecting journalists investigating sensitive stories. By noon, reporters from 3 national news networks were demanding answers about why a residential neighborhood was surrounded by unmarked government vehicles. By evening, the story had broken on every major news platform in the country. The investigation that followed revealed that Oakwood Heights was one of 19 similar neighborhoods across the country where government contractors had been studying the effectiveness of different surveillance and behavioral manipulation techniques on unwitting subjects. The research was being conducted under multiple classified programs with names like Community Safety Initiative and Domestic Threat Assessment Protocol. Our specific neighborhood was testing whether constant surveillance combined with subtle social pressure from planted neighbors could influence residents' political beliefs, spending habits, and social interactions without their knowledge. The friendly neighbors who always knew too much about our business weren't just nosy. They were paid actors whose job was to guide our behavior in predetermined directions. The legal aftermath took 3 years to resolve. The class action lawsuit eventually included 2,147 residents from multiple states who had been subjected to unauthorized surveillance and behavioral manipulation. David testified as a cooperating witness, providing details about the recruitment and training process for surveillance assets like himself. The settlement was partially sealed due to national security concerns, but each affected family received compensation in the mid-6 figures, along with guarantees that all surveillance equipment would be removed and destroyed. The government contractors involved lost their security clearances and faced criminal charges for conducting unauthorized human research experiments. David and I divorced within 6 months of the story breaking, but the divorce proceedings were complicated by the fact that our entire relationship had been based on deception for research purposes. The court ultimately ruled that any assets acquired during our marriage were subject to the fraud settlement, giving me additional compensation beyond the class action award. The most lasting impact was the congressional investigation that followed, leading to new laws requiring explicit consent for any government-sponsored research involving surveillance of American citizens. The story also sparked a national conversation about the balance between security and privacy in the digital age. Garrett left Tech Connect and started his own company specializing in counter-surveillance services for families who suspected they might be under unauthorized monitoring. He now helps people detect hidden surveillance equipment and has uncovered 7 more similar operations since our case went public. Vincent became a consultant for privacy rights organizations, teaching people how to protect themselves from sophisticated surveillance techniques. Rachel won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative series exposing domestic surveillance programs, and her work led to the shutdown of multiple other classified research projects. As for me, I moved to a small town where I knew I could verify the identity and background of everyone around me. I learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even if everyone else seems to think it's normal. And I learned that the most important warnings sometimes come from people who are just doing their job and notice when something doesn't look right. The most disturbing revelation from the entire experience was discovering how easy it had been to manipulate my perceptions and behavior through carefully orchestrated social interactions. Without Garrett's willingness to speak up about what he'd found in my attic, I might have spent years being studied and manipulated without ever realizing my life was being controlled by people who saw me as nothing more than a test subject.